Before Islam shattered the silence of the desert, Arabia lived under a shadow that few dared to question. Imagine a land where people bowed to stone with absolute conviction, where names whispered for generations carried more weight than truth itself, where fear and hope were handed down like inheritance. These were not harmless traditions. These were beliefs that shaped destinies, justified injustice, and blinded hearts. And once you truly understand how deep this darkness went, you will never look at the rise of Islam the same way again. Before we continue, thank you for watching Islamic Insight channel. From which country are you watching this video? And if you love learning about Islam, its truth, and its history, subscribe to this channel and become part of this journey of understanding and remembrance. Arabia before Islam was not empty of spirituality. That is what makes its story so haunting. The Kaaba already stood, built by Ibrahim and Ismail, peace be upon them both, as a house dedicated to the worship of Allah alone. Pilgrims still circled it. Sacred months were still observed. Traces of truth remained, but they were buried under layers of distortion. Over time, people replaced remembrance with ritual and sincerity with superstition. They did not wake up one day deciding to worship idols. It happened slowly, quietly, across generations, until falsehood felt normal and truth felt strange. The Quran later described this condition with painful clarity, people following what their forefathers followed, even when it led them away from guidance. At the heart of this world stood figures that were never sent by Allah, never spoken of by any prophet, yet were treated as if they held divine authority. Al-Lat and Al-Uzza were not distant or minor symbols. They were central to belief, identity, and fear. People planned journeys, wars, marriages, and sacrifices around them. To question these figures was not just religious rebellion, it was social exile. This is what made the darkness so complete. Falsehood was protected by culture, emotion, and fear of isolation. Islam would later confront all of this, not by blending in, but by tearing the illusion apart completely. The roots of these false gods reveal something deeply human and deeply dangerous. Islamic tradition shows that idolatry often begins not with disbelief, but with exaggeration. A respected place becomes sacred. A memory becomes a symbol becomes a mediator, and eventually the mediator becomes an object of worship. Over time, people stop asking where these beliefs came from. They assume that if their ancestors believed it, it must be true. The Quran exposes this mindset again and again, reminding humanity that truth is not inherited. It is revealed. Al-Lat and Al-Uzza had no revelation, no scripture, no divine permission. They were names repeated until repetition itself felt like proof. The Quran speaks directly to this invention, cutting through centuries of assumption. These names, Allah says, are nothing but labels you and your ancestors have named. No authority came down for them. This single statement collapses an entire belief system. It tells us that false gods survive not because they are powerful, but because people never demand evidence. Desire replaces proof. Habit replaces thought. And once belief becomes emotional instead of rational, it becomes fiercely defended, even when it is false. This is why the Quran constantly calls people back to reflection, to questioning, to using the intellect Allah gave them. Al-Lat in particular was tied to one of the most sensitive needs of human life: provision. In a land where survival depended on rain, trade, and harvest, the idea of a figure that could guarantee sustenance was deeply seductive. People believed blessings flowed through her presence. They traveled to her sanctuary seeking favor, protection for their crops, security for their livelihoods. But Islam later made something unmistakably clear. Provision does not pass through intermediaries. It does not leak from stones or sacred ground. It comes directly from Allah, who provides even for those who deny Him. To believe that sustenance could be controlled by a carved figure was not humility. It was a quiet accusation against Allah, as if His mercy needed assistance, as if His power was limited. This is why the Quran treats such beliefs as more than simple mistakes. They are spiritual distortions. They reshape how people see Allah Himself. When people believed Al-Lat could provide, they slowly stopped turning directly to Allah. Du'as were redirected. Gratitude was misplaced. Fear crept in, fear of losing favor, fear of offending something that had no power at all. Islam came to restore clarity, to break this dependence and return the human heart to its original alignment. One creator, one provider, no partners, no intermediaries invented by fear or tradition. When you understand this, you realize that Al-Lat and Al-Uzza were not just statues standing in the desert. They were systems of belief that controlled behavior, thought, and emotion. And this is exactly why Islam did not compromise with them. Truth does not negotiate with illusion. It exposes it, and once exposed, falsehood cannot survive. Fear has always been one of the strongest tools for controlling human hearts, and Al-Uzza was built almost entirely on fear disguised as strength. She was not worshipped because people felt peace near her, but because they were afraid of what might happen if they ignored her. In a land shaped by tribal warfare, unpredictable travel, and sudden loss, people were desperate for anything that promised protection. Al-Uzza became that promise. She was believed to control victory and defeat, safety and destruction, fortune and disaster. Before battles, her name was invoked. Before journeys, her favor was sought. People believed she could see what they could not see and influence what they could not control. But Islam later revealed something unsettling about this kind of worship. Fear that is misplaced does not protect. It enslaves. The Quran teaches that fear, when directed toward anything other than Allah, shrinks the soul. Instead of courage, it produces anxiety. Instead of trust, it creates dependence on illusion. Those who feared Al-Uzza were not strong. They were trapped. They believed that if they did not honor her, misfortune would follow, and this belief itself became a prison. Islam does not deny fear as a human emotion. It redirects it. Fear is meant to anchor the heart to Allah alone, the only one who truly controls harm and benefit. When fear is handed to a false power, that power grows in the imagination, even though it has no real authority. This is how Al-Uzza dominated minds without ever possessing actual power. What makes this even more striking is that Al-Uzza demanded loyalty, but offered no moral guidance. She did not command justice. She did not forbid oppression. She did not call people to honesty or mercy. Her worship required rituals, sacrifices, and devotion, but it did not require moral change. This is one of the most dangerous aspects of false gods. They allow people to feel spiritually secure while remaining ethically unchanged. Islam came to expose this contradiction. True belief is not measured by offerings placed before stone, but by how belief reshapes behavior, restrains ego, and humbles the heart before Allah. When revelation came, it did not approach these beliefs gently. It confronted them directly, with clarity that left no room for negotiation. In Surah An-Najm, the Quran names Al-Lat and Al-Uzza openly, not to acknowledge their status, but to dismantle it. This was not common in Arabia. To publicly challenge these names was to challenge generations of inherited belief. Yet the Quran does not hesitate. It asks a question that cuts through centuries of superstition. What are these but names you and your ancestors have invented? No authority has come down for them. This single statement collapses their entire foundation. No revelation, no command from Allah. No divine permission, just assumption repeated until it felt sacred. The Quran then exposes the deeper problem beneath idol worship. People were not following guidance. They were following desire. Desire to control fate. Desire to feel protected. Desire to avoid accountability. desire to worship without submitting. Allah describes this as following nothing but conjecture, while true guidance has already come. This is one of the most uncomfortable truths in Islam. False gods do not survive because they are convincing. They survive because they are convenient. They give people what they want emotionally, even if it costs them spiritually. The Quran does not attack intelligence, it challenges intention. Do people want truth, or do they want reassurance without responsibility? Then comes one of the most dangerous claims ever attached to these goddesses, the claim of intercession. People believed Al-Lat and Al-Uzza were daughters of Allah, and that they stood closer to Him than ordinary humans. The idea was simple but deeply corrupt. Worship them, and they will speak for you. Honor them, and they will protect you from divine anger. Islam confronts this belief with uncompromising force. Allah has no children. He does not share His essence, His authority, or His will. The very idea of attributing daughters to Allah, while people themselves disliked having daughters, was exposed by the Quran as hypocrisy layered on ignorance. Intercession in Islam is not denied, but it is strictly controlled. No one intercedes independently. No one speaks without permission. No one benefits another soul unless Allah allows it. By attaching intercession to idols, people were not expressing humility. They were expressing distrust. They behaved as if Allah could not be approached directly, as if His mercy required manipulation, as if His justice could be negotiated through invented figures. Islam shattered this illusion completely. Allah is closer to the human being than imagined intermediaries. He hears directly. He responds directly. And He judges directly. This is why the Quran describes these beliefs not as innocent errors, but as grave distortions. They reshaped how people understood Allah Himself. Instead of seeing Him as near, merciful, and just, they imagined Him as distant, inaccessible, and dependent on intermediaries. Al-Lat and Al-Uzza did not elevate people toward Allah. They pushed people away from Him while pretending to draw them closer. This is the most dangerous form of misguidance, when falsehood wears the mask of devotion. Islam came to restore balance. No daughters, no partners, no mediators created by fear or tradition. Just one creator, one authority, one source of mercy and judgment. When these verses were revealed, they did not merely criticize old beliefs. They dismantled the emotional and psychological scaffolding that held those beliefs in place. They forced people to confront a painful question. If these figures have no authority, no revelation, no power to intercede, then what exactly have we been worshipping all this time? That question marked the beginning of the collapse. Because once belief is exposed as empty, it cannot survive on fear alone forever. And the Quran knew this. It did not need to physically destroy Al-Uzza or Al-Lat at that moment. It destroyed the illusion first. The stone would fall later. The belief had already been shattered. What made the worship of Al-Lat and Al-Uzza so deeply rooted was not theology, but psychology. These idols did not survive because people believed they created the heavens or controlled existence in the absolute sense. They survived because they gave people emotional comfort without demanding inner change. Idol worship in pre-Islamic Arabia offered a sense of control in a world filled with uncertainty. Life was harsh, unpredictable, and often brutal. Travel was dangerous, survival was fragile, and tribal conflict could erupt at any moment. In that environment, people clung to anything that promised stability, even if that promise was built on illusion. Al-Lat and Al-Uzza became emotional anchors. Turning away from them felt risky, not because of evidence, but because fear had been cultivated for generations. This is why idol worship was so difficult to uproot. It was not just a belief system, it was a psychological habit. People grew up watching their elders make sacrifices, whisper prayers, and attribute success or disaster to these figures. Children absorbed these ideas before they ever learned to question them. By the time they were adults, the idols felt familiar, even intimate. To abandon them felt like betrayal of family, tribe, and identity. Islam later described this attachment with piercing accuracy. It was blind following, not thoughtful belief. Hearts were tied to tradition more tightly than to truth. Another powerful element was the absence of moral pressure. These idols did not ask people to change how they treated the weak, how they earned their wealth, or how they controlled their desires. You could worship Al-Uzza fiercely and still oppress, cheat and act unjustly. There was no internal reckoning, no reminder of accountability beyond vague fear. Islam would later expose this as one of the clearest signs of false worship. True belief reshapes the self. False belief decorates the ego. Al-Lat and Al-Uzza demanded rituals but left the soul untouched, and that made them easy to love. Islam arrived with a message that was far more demanding and far less comfortable. It stripped away excuses and placed responsibility directly on the individual. No idol could carry your sins. No intermediary could guarantee safety. No tradition could save you from accountability. This was terrifying for some and liberating for others. For those who had grown tired of pretending, Islam felt like clarity. For those who benefited from the old system, it felt like threat. This is why resistance was so intense. Islam was not just replacing gods. It was dismantling an entire psychological framework built on fear, convenience, and inherited obedience. When the Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him, began to publicly call people away from Al-Lat and Al-Uzza, he was not only challenging belief, he was challenging power. The elites of Quraysh understood exactly what was at stake. These idols were not just religious symbols, they were pillars of social control. Whoever controlled the sacred controlled the people. Pilgrimage, offerings, prestige, and influence all flowed through these false sanctities. Removing them meant redistributing authority. Islam threatened to level a hierarchy that had been protected by superstition for generations. Yet the Prophet did not approach this mission with compromise or ambiguity. He did not offer a softer version of idol worship or allow coexistence between truth and falsehood. Revelation made the line unmistakably clear. There is no God but Allah. Everything else is false. This clarity was unsettling, but it was also honest. Islam does not soothe the ego. It confronts it. It does not decorate fear. It dissolves it by reconnecting the heart directly to its creator. The ultimate exposure of Al-Uzza came not through argument, but through reality. Authentic Islamic tradition preserves the moment when her physical symbol was destroyed. When the shrine associated with Al-Uzza was confronted, there was no divine defense, no retaliation, no supernatural response. The figure people feared for generations stood powerless. No voice spoke, no force intervened. The silence was absolute, and that silence was louder than any argument. Everything people had feared simply did not happen. This moment carried enormous weight. It was not just the destruction of stone, it was the collapse of psychological domination. Fear thrives on anticipation. Once anticipation is proven false, fear loses its grip. The people who witnessed this realized something profound. The power they had imagined was never real. The control they feared was never there. What they had been submitting to all along was their own imagination reinforced by tradition. Islamic tradition does not celebrate this moment as a victory of violence, but as a victory of truth. Falsehood does not need to be debated endlessly. When truth stands firm, falsehood collapses under its own emptiness. The Prophet did not replace Al-Uzza with another symbol. He removed symbols altogether. He redirected hearts to Allah alone, without intermediaries, without sacred objects, without invented fear. This is why the story of Al-Lat and Al-Uzza remains deeply relevant. It is not only about statues in the desert, it is about how humans surrender their hearts to anything that promises security, without submission. The idols of today may not be carved from stone, but the psychology is the same. Fear of loss, fear of rejection, fear of uncertainty drives people to attach meaning and authority to things that cannot save them. Islam cuts through all of it with one uncompromising truth. Nothing deserves fear, hope, love, or obedience except Allah. When Al-Uzza fell silent, it was not just an end. It was a beginning of clarity, courage, and spiritual honesty. The silence of the false gods made room for a voice that had always been there, the call to worship the one who never needed an image, never needed defense, and never abandoned those who turned to him sincerely. After the fall of these idols, something far more unsettling than destruction settled over the land. Silence. Not the silence of fear, but the silence of exposure. For generations, people had been warned that anger would descend if Al-Lat or Al-Uzza were challenged. They were told calamity would strike, blood would spill, crops would fail, and divine punishment would follow anyone who dared to confront them. Yet when these figures were stripped of their sanctity, nothing happened. No disaster followed. No unseen force responded. The world continued exactly as it had before. The sun rose. The wind moved across the desert. Life carried on untouched. This silence was devastating to false belief because it revealed a truth that words alone could not. The gods people feared were never listening. They were never watching. They were never in control. The Quran repeatedly invites people to reflect on this very moment. How can something worshipped be unable to defend itself? How can fear be placed in something that cannot hear a prayer or answer a call? This is not mockery. It is an invitation to think. Islam never asks people to believe blindly. It asks them to observe reality honestly. The silence of these idols was not proof created by argument. It was proof created by absence, an absence of response, an absence of power, an absence of authority. Everything people had imagined collapsed in a single moment of stillness. What followed was internal struggle. Some hearts accepted the truth immediately. Others resisted desperately. Not because evidence was lacking, but because admitting the truth meant admitting a lifetime of misplaced devotion. It meant acknowledging that sacrifices were wasted, fears were unfounded, and trust had been given to emptiness. This is one of the hardest moments a human being can face, the moment when certainty dissolves. Islam does not underestimate this pain. The Quran recognizes how deeply people cling to inherited beliefs, even when they know they are false. Pride becomes the final barrier when evidence has already arrived. This is why Islam describes these idols as powerless not only in this world, but in the next. On the day of judgment, those who were worshipped falsely will disown those who worshipped them. Not because they were once divine and lost their status, but because they never had any authority to begin with. The Quran paints this scene to strip away the last illusion. Nothing you fear besides Allah will stand with you when accountability arrives. Nothing you depend on besides Him will answer when you are called alone. And this is where the story moves beyond history and becomes a warning. Al-Lat and Al-Uzza may be gone, but the mindset that created them remains alive in every era. Whenever people place ultimate hope, fear, or obedience in something created, they revive the same error in a new form. Sometimes it is wealth. Sometimes it is power. Sometimes it is influence, ideology, or identity. The object changes, but the pattern does not. Islam identifies this pattern with brutal honesty. Anything that takes the place of Allah in the heart becomes a false god, even if it has no statue, no shrine, and no name. The Quran does not present these stories to entertain or to shame the past. It presents them to awaken the present. The destruction of idols in Arabia was not the end of shirk. It was the exposure of its mechanics. Fear mixed with desire. Tradition replacing revelation. Comfort valued over truth. These same forces operate today, quietly, subtly, often disguised as progress or personal freedom. Islam stands against all of it with the same uncompromising clarity it showed in the desert. This is why the Quran repeatedly challenges humanity to ask a simple but terrifying question: who truly controls harm and benefit? Who holds life and death? Who responds when you are desperate and alone? When this question is answered honestly, every false attachment begins to loosen. The silence of Al-Lat and Al-Uzza echoes through time, reminding humanity that anything besides Allah will eventually fail you, not out of cruelty, but out of incapacity. Islam does not leave people empty after removing false gods. It replaces fear with trust. It replaces superstition with certainty. It replaces inherited illusion with revealed truth. Where idols once demanded appeasement, Allah offers mercy. Where false gods demanded ritual without morality, Allah demands justice with compassion. Where intermediaries once stood as barriers, Allah removes every barrier and invites the servant to call upon Him directly. This is the deeper meaning behind the collapse of these ancient figures. It was not a cultural shift alone. It was a restoration of human dignity. No longer bowed to stone, no longer ruled by imagined forces, no longer afraid of silence. Instead, connected to the one who speaks through revelation, who hears without intermediaries, and who never abandons those who turn to Him sincerely. The warning is clear and timeless. Falsehood can dominate societies for centuries, but it cannot survive truth forever. And truth does not always arrive with noise. Sometimes it arrives with silence so complete that it forces the heart to finally listen. When Islam tore down Al-Lat and Al-Uzza, it did not leave a spiritual vacuum. It replaced confusion with clarity, fear with dignity, and submission to creation with direct connection to the Creator. This is the heart of Tawhid, not as an abstract concept, but as a lived liberation of the soul. Tawhid does not merely state that Allah is one. It demands that nothing else competes for the space in the human heart that belongs to Him alone. No fear shares His authority. No hope rivals His promise. No loyalty overrides obedience to Him. This is why Tawhid was so threatening to the old order. It dismantled every system built on manipulation, inherited fear, and spiritual dependency. For the people of Arabia, Tawhid was revolutionary. It stripped away the need for intermediaries and sacred gatekeepers. No priesthood, no bloodline with exclusive access, no shrine holding leverage over destiny. Every human being stood equal before Allah, accountable for their actions, responsible for their choices, and capable of turning directly to their Lord without permission from stone or tribe. This was not just a theological shift, it was the restoration of human dignity. A person no longer needed to fear offending Al-Uzza or pleasing Al-Lat. What mattered was sincerity, justice, and consciousness of Allah in private and in public. Tawhid also redefined strength. Strength was no longer measured by how fiercely one defended idols or traditions, but by how truthfully one submitted to reality. Islam taught that the strongest heart is the one anchored to Allah alone, unshaken by loss, threat, or uncertainty. When fear is placed only in Allah, everything else loses its power to intimidate. This is why the earliest believers could endure persecution, boycott, and isolation without breaking. Their fear had been purified, their hope had been clarified. They were no longer negotiating with illusions. This liberation was internal before it was external. Tawhid demanded honesty with the self. No more hiding behind rituals, no more outsourcing accountability to invented intercessors. Every prayer, every action, every intention now mattered. Islam replaced performative worship with conscious worship. It replaced inherited belief with chosen submission. And this is why Tawhid transformed individuals before it transformed societies. A heart freed from false gods cannot be controlled by false fear. The story of Al-Lat and Al-Uzza does not end with their destruction. It continues as a mirror held up to every generation. The Quran preserved their names deliberately, not to give them relevance, but to expose a pattern that repeats whenever humans forget their purpose. False gods do not always appear as statues. Sometimes they appear as unchecked desires, as power worship, as identity obsession, as blind loyalty to culture or ideology. The shape changes. The danger remains the same. Anything that demands absolute devotion besides Allah becomes a modern echo of those ancient idols. Islam warns that this association can be subtle. A person may claim belief in Allah while fearing loss more than disobedience, while trusting wealth more than provision from the Creator, while obeying social pressure over divine command. The Quran calls this a divided heart. Tawhid demands wholeness. It demands alignment between belief and reliance. The lesson of Al-Lat and Al-Uzza is not limited to history books. It is written into the daily choices of every believer. And yet, the message of Islam is not one of despair or accusation. It is a message of return. Allah does not expose falsehood to humiliate humanity. He exposes it to free them. The collapse of these idols was an invitation to rediscover what had always been true. That Allah never left, that He never needed partners, that He was always near, hearing every prayer even when people redirected their calls elsewhere. The final lesson is both sobering and comforting. Sobering because it reminds us how easily entire civilizations can be built on illusion. Comforting because it proves that truth does not need time, numbers, or power to survive. It only needs clarity. Al-Lat and Al-Uzza once commanded devotion, fear, and sacrifice. Today, they exist only as names recited as warnings. Their silence stands as testimony that nothing falsely worshipped can endure. Islam did not erase history. It preserved it with meaning, so that every generation could look back and understand that guidance is not automatic, that tradition is not truth, and that fear is a poor substitute for faith. When everything else collapses, when every illusion fades, one reality remains untouched. Allah is one. He alone is worthy of worship. He alone holds authority, and He alone never fails those who turn to Him with sincerity and understanding.